Welcome to the DSTL Arts Community Bridges workshop series on the Civil Rights era. Today's workshop is called Healing History, and we'll be looking at the Civil Rights Movement in the United States and how it inspired the Armenian community's own quest for justice. We'll be looking at some poems written by Armenian writers, and we'll be looking at conditional phrases and learning about how to use that strategy to write our own poetry. Are you excited? Because I am. So let's start out looking at a poem by the writer Maro Markaryan. She was an Armenian poet. She was born in 1915 in the country of Georgia, not the state, but the country that was once part of the Soviet Union. She went to universities in Moscow and Yerevan, which is the capital city of Armenia, and she actually died in 1999. She was also a political activist and was a very popular poet of her time, and I guess still today. So the original poem was written in Armenian, so I'm going to read to you that poem in Armenian first, just so you can hear what it sounds like, and then I'm going to read it to the translation to you in English. So starting out with the Armenian version, it's actually an untitled poem by Maro Markaryan. Here we go. Ինչ որ մի արդար բան կա աշխարհում, լույս հաղորդումով ու հատուցումով, բայց գալիս է նա ժամանակն անցած, միշտ սիրավրեպ, ծայր ուշացումով, չհասած նրան, ում պիտի հասներ, եւ ավելի է սրտերը վառում։ Ինչ որ մի արդար ու շատ անարդար բան կա աշխարհում. So that's the Armenian version. Now I'm going to read to you the translation in English. There's something kind of just in this world, bestowing and disseminating light, but arriving after its time has passed, always like a mistimed love, endlessly delayed, never reaching the one it was meant to reach, leaving hearts all the more singed. There's something kind of just and yet very unjust in this world. So that's the poem by Maro Markaryan. And I guess the first thing that comes to mind when I read this poem is the idea of something being just and unjust at the same time. It's not usually how we're used to thinking of things, right? They're either just or they're unjust, but the writer suggests that there is something that can be both, actually, a little bit just and still very unjust. I'd like you to just take a moment to think about what that could be. Can you think of things in your life or in the world around you that you see that is both just and unjust? Why would the writer say it like that? It makes me think about how when somebody is imprisoned, wrongfully convicted, and then years down the road, DNA evidence might clear them and they're released to go back to their families. And there could be 10 or 20 years that's gone by in between. And we say that justice has been served because that person is released. Well, what happens when there's actually an injustice first and then justice comes much later, as the poet is talking about a justice that's delayed and what the impact of that is? And in fact, what justice is, does it exist before there's actually an injustice? Isn't justice the thing that comes to fix something that was wrong and trying to make it right? Anyway, these are just some things for you to think about as we go into the next part of our lesson. So let's talk a little bit about history to kind of set up some context for what we're going to be doing later. In the mid-1800s, as you know, our country, the United States, fought a civil war and abolished slavery officially. And yet, almost 100 years later, Black Americans in some parts of the country were still living like second-class citizens in a way and facing the impact of intolerance, racial violence. They did not have the experience of equal rights under the law. They were blocked in some cases from registering to vote, and so did not have truly equal representation in government. We see things like lynchings happening in the South, and yet, not real any justice to protect citizens from that kind of violence or any justice coming afterwards, after these actions are taken. So in the 1900s, in the mid 1900s, we see Black Americans starting to organize and becoming more active in terms of lobbying for their civil rights and for equal representation in government. For example, in the South, we would still see some public and private facilities that were segregated, whites only and black only separated facilities. Some of the activism that started to take place or be organized were non-violent protests, sit-ins at counters that were whites only, where black activists refused to leave until they were served, boycotting of the bus system to economically impact that system, since many of the passengers were Black Americans. So there were a lot of activities like this that were taking place, and we start to see some of the impact of that activism, although it was, they were met with brutality at first by local police. They were able to make some changes. In 1948, we see that the armed forces become desegregated. Then in 1954, we see the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education, where segregated schools were ruled as unconstitutional, and therefore segregated schools became effectively illegal in the United States. This ruling would impact segregation of all minorities, including Mexican Americans and Native Americans. Ethnic only segregated schools were now effectively illegal at public school system, right? In some places, those schools still remain segregated because of public intolerance. But when federal marshals and federal troops got involved, they were able to enforce this because it was the law of the land and cause segregation to break down and have public schools be desegregated. And then in 1964, within a year of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this prevents employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. So this is going to impact not only the Black American community, but women and citizens of all religions. So it really is a huge breakthrough that comes about because of the civil rights movement. So now we're going to just go back a little bit in time, back again to the mid-1800s, across the ocean in Turkey, Armenians living there with a 3,000-year-old history on their ancestral homeland. But for 6 centuries at that point, they were living under Ottoman rule, ruled by Ottoman Turks. And in that society, because they were Christians in a Muslim state, they were classified as dhimmi, which were non-Muslim citizens. And as such, they also living as second-class citizens in that society. They were taxed higher than Muslim citizens, and at some point double what Muslim citizens were being taxed. In rural areas, this could lead to extreme poverty. Their testimony didn't have the same weight in court as a Muslim citizen's, and so any crimes couldn't really be effectively prosecuted. And this also made them targets of criminal activity and racial violence. Some of the criminal activity that we see is property being stolen, brides being kidnapped on their wedding day. One particular type of hate crime that I only recently learned about is the practice of nailing or shoeing, where spikes are driven through the hands or the feet. And it's not just a torture tactic, but it's also kind of a way of humiliating the Christian religion of Armenians, kind of relating it to the crucifixion of Christ. It's something that in my research I discovered was not only used by government officials to interrogate under torture, but also public citizens just doing it to each other. And it's in line with the same kind of thing, like the lynchings that were happening in the South in the United States. It's definitely a hate crime. That was the state of Armenians in up to the 1800s and early 1900s. Some Armenians who were a little bit more well-to-do merchants, they sent their kids off to study in Europe. And those students who were going to school at the Sorbonne in Paris or in schools in Georgia or Russia, or even students in Turkey who were attending American Protestant schools, they were being exposed to ideas about the French Revolution and the American Revolution. They were inspired by ideas of equality and civil rights and civil disobedience, and having to fight and stand up for your rights. And so they came out of these schools and encouraged the community to begin to also organize and lobby for civil rights and equal representation in government. The Armenian community in Turkey begins their activism with also nonviolent protests and placards and petitions to the government. And at the same time as the conversation for reforms are happening in Turkey, there's also a backlash from Muslims and from more extremists who are afraid of losing their hierarchical status in the country. And so conditions actually deteriorate for Armenians rather than get better. In 1909, the Young Turk Revolution happens, and the hope is very high that things are going to get better. But by 1913, extremists have taken over the party, and they begin to adopt an ideology similar to the Nazi ideology of a country with only Turks. And so by 1915, we see the planning and execution of a systematic annihilation of their Armenian population. And by the time they're done, the Armenian population of Armenia, 2/3 of it has perished, an approximate 1.5 million people. As you can imagine, survivors of the genocide did not find themselves back in Turkey. They became immigrants that went all over the world, forming Armenian communities in many different countries, something that is now known as the Armenian diaspora. We fast forward to 1965, back here in the United States, as part of the civil rights movement, the activism. A march was planned from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and this was March of 1965. And the first attempt to make that march was actually met with police brutality against the nonviolent protesters. The local media captured this, and actually it was seen nationwide. The public reaction was overwhelming, and this forced federal government to put pressure on state governments, to put pressure on local governments. And so then later on in March 1965, that march was made successfully without incident, and also with the participation of people of different nationalities and races. 1 month later, after March 1965, April 1965 would mark the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And at that point, the Armenian community, who was, immigrant community, was getting settled all over the place, but there hadn't been any recognition or acknowledgement or apologies or any kind of reparations made by the Turkish government, that was still denying that a genocide even happened, despite ample documentation. And the Armenian community, seeing what was happening with the civil rights movement, I think they were very inspired by the impact that they were able to make. It was difficult, it was challenging, they were met with violence, but ultimately they were seeing that their actions were making a difference, that what they were doing was having an effect, a positive effect, and making things a little bit better. So on April 24th, 1965, 50 years after 1915, the Armenian community started to organize peaceful protests on April 24th all over the world in their communities. And this became actually an annual tradition, and also led to political lobbying of the US government, which was an ally of Turkey, and other international governments, to put pressure on Turkey to have that make a difference, the difference that they were seeing here in the United States. Despite all of the headway that was made by the civil rights movement, as you know, that movement still continues today. And intolerance is something, and prejudice, that exists in society, in our society. And so it's something that we're still fighting against. And the Armenian community's quest for justice also continues. It was acknowledged, the genocide was acknowledged by international governments all around the world. In the United States, however, it took until 2019, almost 105 years after the genocide, before the United States was willing to acknowledge it. And of course, the quest for Turkey's acknowledgement and any reparations and apology from that government is still ongoing. As you can see from the discussion about these historical events, the road to justice can be very long. And as we were talking about before, about justice and what is its impact when it's delayed, what happens in that in between time? Is that another type of injustice? Does it add to the injustice that's being fought? I don't know. These are all things for us to be thinking about. At which point does justice actually look a lot like injustice? They start to become kind of blurry, right? In the gray area, like the initial poem that we were reading earlier in this workshop. And while you're thinking about that, we're going to read one more poem. The poem that we're going to be reading is called Armenian Pastoral, 1915. It was written by Gregory Janikian, who is a diasporan Armenian poet. He was actually born in Alexandria, Egypt, but came here to the United States when he was 8 years old. He was at one time, for many years, the director of creative writing at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's published several collections of poetry and won an award from the National Endowment of the Arts, as well as other awards. The poem begins with a quote, "Memory is useless if none of us remembers the same things." And it's a quote by Bruce Murphy. If Anush were holding her child and watching the sheep carted off like men to the slaughter, and Armenag, in his dark vest and trousers, were hobbling barefoot in the village toward the pock-marked wall, and Ashod, in his prison cell, were counting the sprigs of parsley that must be rising in his garden now. If Araksi were razor thin by the roadside, dreaming of a white mountain turning red in the alpenglow. If Antranik, refusing to walk, were shod like a horse and tethered in his own pasture. And Asniv were a wet nurse now to a battalion of mouths, her infant slit clean in the straw. How long would it have to go on then, beginning with A and spilling over into all the alphabets, before mother, sister, father, child could wear the same faces in any language, be cut from the same tongue? So one of the things I really like about this poem is the way the author describes something that's very specific in terms of, names of people that are Armenian names, all of these, Anush, Armenag, Ashod, Araksi. Actually, my grandparents' names were Armenag and Araksi. So it takes something that is very specific to kind of Armenian culture, but in the end, he kind of makes it much more universal and kind of calls us to see that justice or injustice when it occurs is something that happens to all of us, not just to one person. Sometimes I think so many minorities in different situations have to fight for their rights or equality, and they do it alone. But I think, we see so much injustice in this world. What would it be like if all the minorities came together as one? Maybe they wouldn't be such a minority anymore. That if we could all fight for each other's rights, maybe we would see more of an impact. Anyway, I really like that about this poem, that it takes something that is very specific and personal to Armenian history, but makes it more universal and makes it a human problem. The fact that things like genocide should happen to anybody in the world really shouldn't be okay. I'm really proud of some of my Armenian friends who they don't think that it's an Armenian problem. And whenever they see injustice or ethnic cleansing or anything like that happening anywhere in the world, they feel that they need to speak out, because we all wish that someone had spoken up, or we were grateful for those people who did speak out at the time. You might notice that there's the way that the poem is assembled is it's one big long sentence that starts with if Anush were holding her child, and if Araksi were razor thin by the roadside, if Antanik refusing to walk. And this is kind of the structure of something we call the conditional sentence. A conditional sentence is A sentence that speculates what could happen, what might have happened, and what we wish would happen. And it's made up of two parts. The one part is an if clause that specifies a condition or an action. And then there's the main clause that describes a result. I think it's very appropriate to what we're talking about today because we're talking about cause and effect and the things that happen to us, the things that we do, and what impact they have. So an example of a conditional sentence might be, if it rains, the event will be canceled. And here in this poem, we're seeing the author talking about something that resembles something that could have happened, but then proposing a different result, proposing a future or a present where what happens to one person is felt by all. Phrases it like it's like, what if this were the case? But in so doing, he kind of is also saying that it is kind of the case, right? That bad thing that happens to someone else, it happens to all of us. The other thing that conditional sentences, when they're used in a poem like this, provide is they create a kind of suspense, right? Because they start out with if this, if that, and we kind of know that in a conditional sentence, we know instinctively that there has to be another part. You can't have an if and then just dot dot dot, it just ends. There is something that comes afterwards. So when you build a poem that starts with if and keeps asking if, in this case, we know that it's coming to a point where there's going to be a conclusion. There's going to be a second part of it. There's going to be, and this. So here's the cause, and then this is going to be the effect. And so it kind of keeps us on the edge of our seats waiting to see what is the author going to say about how these ifs end. So we're going to take all of the things that we've been talking about and learning about and looking at these, seeing in these poems. And we're actually going to try to write our own poem. I know you can do this. We're going to start making a list of conditional sentences. You're going to make your own. It can be about anything, any kind of social injustice that you see in the world that affects you. It can be personal. It can be something about your community. Pick something, and then let's start writing some conditional sentences about that. If this, then that, right? You don't have to use the word then, but the if can be if something in the past happened or didn't happen, then in the present or in the future, this would have happened. It can also be something in the present. If this happens or doesn't happen now, then this other thing could happen or would happen in the future, right? So there's different ways to form the sentences. I want you to take some time now and write some conditional sentences around the social injustice that you've chosen. And once you've done that, then we're going to take those sentences and we're going to assemble them into a poem, similar to how the poem that we just read. It doesn't have to be one long conditional sentence. It could be like this poem where it's like, if this happened, if that happened, if this happened, if that happened, and then one conclusion, one result at the end. So all these different causes, and then this is the effect. It could be a bunch of cause and effect sentences, or it could be one cause, if this happened, and then a bunch of results, then this would happen, then that would happen, then this is how the world would be, right? So you have all these different options of how to craft your poem. But first, we're going to start with making those conditional sentences, making a list like that, and then you're going to figure out how you want to put it together. Let's look at some examples, right, of conditional phrases based on just the historical events that we were talking about today. So here's one where it has a present action and has a present result. If intolerance goes unchecked, inhumanity thrives. So if intolerance right now is being unchecked, then inhumanity is something that gets to thrive. Here's another one. This is a present action with a future result. If inhumane treatment is recorded and broadcast, the general public will react. So if inhumane treatment is recorded and broadcast, like it was on Bloody Sunday when the march from Selma to Montgomery ended in violence, if inhumane treatment is recorded and broadcast, the general public will react in the future, which they did. Here's one where with a past action, something happened in the past and how it affects the present. If equal rights had not been denied them, the people would not be protesting right now. So if equal rights had not been denied them, something that happened in the past, if that hadn't happened, then right now the people would not be protesting. Kind of see how that works? So you can just, based on your own theme that's rattling around in your brain right now, you can take that and start asking the what if. What if things had been different? Or what if they could be different now? How would the future look? Or if things continue the way that they are now, then what will the future bring us? So you can look at it from very different angles, but based on how you write those sentences, you're probably going to give us a message of either hope that things could be better, or maybe you want to use your sentences to show just how bad things could be, or how bad they are now, or how bad they were, or how you wish you could have changed them. If you could go back in time, how you would make them different. That's what conditional sentences allow us to do. They allow us to kind of wave a little magic wand and imagine things in a different way. And, I hope you will. I know we can't always change everything that happens in our environment, but I hope you will try to speak up and take action and make changes where you can and when you can. And I hope you've enjoyed this workshop. I've enjoyed spending this time with you. Good luck with your poems.